The bustling terminal of Los Angeles International Airport felt like the pulse of a city that never stopped moving. The hum of conversations, the rhythmic click of shoes against marble floors, the rush of travelers eager to get to their next destination, all blended into the symphony of everyday life. Yet for James Turner, today was different. Today he wasn't just a mechanic or a small business owner. Today he was a passenger in first class, a rare privilege, a hard-earned milestone. James wasn't the type to stand out, at least not in the way most people expected. His dark jeans, faded gray t-shirt, and worn leather jacket weren't the kind of clothing that screamed wealth. But the leather jacket, though weathered, held a story. A story of years spent working under the hoods of cars, of building his life from the ground up. His calloused hands had earned every stitch of that jacket, every crease in his shirt, and the flight he was about to take. As he made his way toward Gate B12, he felt the weight of the first-class boarding pass in his pocket. It was a symbol of the struggle, the long hours, the sleepless nights spent grinding at his auto repair shops. And now here he was, walking among the elite, seated among those who had seemingly always belonged in the lavish world of first class. James had earned every bit of this. He was proud of his achievements, but he didn't need to boast about them. His success, quiet and unassuming, was enough to carry him forward. And that's what he was going to do. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the comfort of this rare experience. His thoughts were interrupted by the loud call of the gate agent, directing first-class passengers to board. James stepped forward, presenting his ticket with a steady hand. The agent smiled warmly, offering a nod that signified not just the routine exchange of a ticket for a seat, but a subtle acknowledgement of the man before her. A man who, though his attire didn't scream luxury, deserved to be here just as much as anyone else. With a quiet nod of thanks, James walked down the jet bridge. The cool air outside felt like a breath of fresh air, a brief escape from the heat of the crowded terminal. As he stepped onto the plane, he could feel the weight of the moment settle in. His eyes took in the plush interior of the first-class cabin. Soft, luxurious seats, a level of comfort that was, in his eyes, a reward for years of hard work. He made his way to his seat, 2A, window side. The seat molded to his frame like it had been made for him, offering a brief moment of solace before the flight took off. James let out a quiet breath, the tension of the day beginning to fade away. This was his time, his rare chance to experience the comfort and privilege that came with his seat. He glanced out the window at the tarmac, watching as baggage handlers moved in synchronized chaos, their orange vests bright against the dull concrete. The noise of the plane's engines reverberated through the cabin, signaling the start of his journey. And just as he began to settle in, the door to the cabin opened with a sharp whoosh, and in stepped Matthew Reynolds. Reynolds, a towering figure in his late 40s, had the air of someone who owned everything around him. His tailored charcoal suit clung to his broad frame, his salt and pepper hair slicked back with meticulous care. A sleek rolling suitcase trailed behind him, its wheels gliding smoothly over the carpet as he walked. A real estate mogul, a man whose wealth and power were as finely polished as his appearance. To someone like Matthew, first class wasn't a privilege, it was his birthright, a space designed for people like him, people who had always belonged. So when his eyes landed on James sitting by the window, his gaze narrowed almost imperceptibly, as if trying to assess the man who dared to sit in the same cabin. Matthew's eyes scanned James's outfit, worn jacket, faded jeans, scuffed sneakers, and his lips curled into a small, condescending smirk. The arrogance was palpable, but James, aware of the subtle assessment, didn't flinch. He sat straight in his seat, hands resting lightly on the armrests. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Not today. As Matthew approached, he casually took his seat in 2B, his broad frame squeezing into the seat beside James. He stowed his suitcase in the overhead bin with an exaggerated grunt, then adjusted his suit jacket with the precision of a man who was accustomed to getting his way. The air between them was thick with an unspoken tension, one that James could feel in his bones. He couldn't help but notice the way Matthew's eyes flicked over him, as though he were something beneath notice, something out of place in this pristine environment. The moment settled, but just as James was about to lose himself in the view of the clouds outside, he heard a voice cut through the calm. "Guess they're letting anyone in first class these days," Matthew said, his voice loud enough to carry through the cabin. The words hung in the air like a blade. There was no mistaking the mockery, the derision. James's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze forward, refusing to give Matthew the satisfaction of a reaction. The cabin was silent, save for the faint hum of the engines as the flight attendants moved up and down the aisle. Some of the passengers glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the exchange, but no one spoke up. James, however, had no intention of letting this man go unchallenged. With a steady breath, he turned slightly, meeting Matthew's gaze. "I paid for this seat." "Same as you," James said, his voice calm but firm. The words landed, simple and direct. For a moment, Matthew's smirk faltered. His eyes shifted, narrowing slightly as if recalculating the situation. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cocky grin, the same sense of superiority that James had grown so accustomed to. "Sure you did," Matthew muttered, his tone now dripping with a faint sneer. "Standards are dropping. Used to be you could tell who belonged up here." James' hands curled around the armrest, but he said nothing. The tension between them simmered, building with every word exchanged, and he could feel it. Something was about to break. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the world outside blurred into streaks of gray and gold. James couldn't help but wonder how long he could ignore the subtle attacks, the insidious judgments from a man who believed his wealth gave him the right to impose his worldview on others. The engines roared to life, drowning out the chatter of the cabin, and the plane began its ascent. James leaned back in his seat, the vibrations of the plane humming through his chest. He wasn't here to make a statement, but as long as Matthew kept pushing, James couldn't help but feel a quiet storm building. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the plane soared higher into the sky, the world outside the window seemed to shrink, the sprawling cityscapes and busy highways blurring into streaks of color. James felt a brief sense of detachment, like he was suspended in a space where he could simply exist without the noise of the world around him. But the moment was fleeting. Victor Reynolds, sitting just inches away, had a different aura entirely. He seemed as if he belonged to the sky itself, perfectly groomed, his suit sharp enough to cut glass. His gaze, once casual, now lingered on James with a sharper edge, like a predator sizing up its prey. James tried to ignore him. He turned his head back to the window, letting the soft hum of the engines fill his thoughts. But Victor wasn't the type to let silence slide. After a few moments, he leaned over slightly, just enough to invade James's space. His knee brushed against James's leg, an unnecessary proximity that carried a subtle challenge. James felt the weight of the tension. He could hear Victor's breathing, low and controlled, but still an audible reminder of the discomfort between them. He exhaled slowly, trying to keep his mind focused on the task ahead. This wasn't just a flight to Miami. It was an opportunity, a chance for his business to expand even further. He didn't need to get caught up in petty insults, but the man beside him was pushing all the wrong buttons. Victor's voice broke the silence again, this time softer but no less biting. "You know, for someone who claims to have earned it, you don't exactly fit the profile." His tone was light, but there was venom in the words that made it impossible for James to ignore. "I mean, first class isn't for just anyone, right?" James felt his body tense at the remark, his jaw tightening as he fought the urge to snap. But he couldn't let this man win. Not here. Not like this. "I've earned everything I have," James replied, his voice steady but firm, each word cutting through the cabin like a blade. "Not just this seat, but everything I've worked for. And it doesn't matter what you think." Victor's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since sitting down, he seemed to lose his confident composure. The smirk on his face faltered, just slightly, before he leaned back in his seat and crossed his arms, as if regrouping. But the battle was far from over. James could feel the weight of Victor's judgment bearing down on him. The way Victor's eyes flicked over his worn jacket, his well-worn jeans, as though those things defined his worth. But James wasn't going to let him define him. He wasn't going to let anyone do that. The flight attendants began their rounds offering drinks and snacks, but the tension between James and Victor was palpable. As the drinks were passed around, the woman in the red blazer glanced over at the two men, her eyes flicking between them with quiet curiosity. She didn't know it yet, but she would be a witness to something much larger than a petty argument between two passengers. Victor, still looking for a way to maintain his superiority, picked up his tablet from the seat pocket in front of him, pretending to focus on work. But his eyes kept darting back to James, like a dog that had caught a scent it couldn't ignore. You know, Victor started again, his voice low, I'm sure you've had your share of struggles, but not everyone gets the same breaks. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Some of us are born into a life of privilege. That's just how the world works. James couldn't hold it in any longer. The words, like a wound waiting to be exposed, finally broke free. I don't need your sympathy, James said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. I've built my life with my own two hands. No one gave me anything. But people like you don't get it. You think money and power make you better than everyone else. But you're wrong. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment there was silence between them. The buzz of the cabin, the occasional clink of glass, all faded into the background. It was just the two of them, and in that moment, James knew he had struck a chord. Victor's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around his tablet. But he didn't say anything for a long time. The arrogance was still there, lurking behind his eyes, but James could see the flicker of something else. Doubt, maybe, or frustration. The plane leveled out, and for a brief moment, the cabin seemed to breathe again. Passengers continued to chat, the flight attendants moved back and forth, and the soft hum of the engines filled the air. But the battle between James and Victor was far from over. Victor wasn't done yet. He leaned back in his seat, his smirk returning, but this time it was tighter, less genuine. You're right about one thing, he said slowly. Money can't buy respect, but I'm not sure your jacket's going to get you the respect you think you deserve. James' fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his composure. He wasn't going to let this man drag him into a shouting match, but there was a fire burning inside him now, a fire that wouldn't be so easily extinguished. The flight continued, the turbulence of their exchange lingering in the air. James stared out the window again, the clouds now tinged with the golden hues of the setting sun. But even as the world outside seemed to calm, James knew that the storm between him and Victor was far from finished. It had only just begun. The plane had been cruising for hours, the hum of the engines a constant companion as the world outside remained a blur of clouds and sky. For James, the flight had become a test of endurance, not just against the physical discomfort of sitting in first class, but against the mental fatigue of dealing with Victor's incessant jabs. Victor was no longer hiding his disdain. It was there in every glance, every sharp comment, every word that dripped with the false sweetness of condescension. But now it wasn't just about James. It was about winning. Victor needed to prove something. To James, to the entire cabin, to himself. His eyes were locked onto James, as if trying to will him into submission, to break him with nothing more than words. James sat rigid in his seat, his grip on the armrest tightening. He wasn't going to let this man dictate his worth. The insults kept coming, relentless and sharp, and James's patience was starting to wear thin. The cabin, once a place of quiet comfort, now felt like a battleground. The tension between them crackled, palpable in the air, thick enough to be sliced. Victor's voice broke through the stillness again, this time louder, carrying just enough force to turn heads. He leaned closer, his face inches from James's ear. His breath, sharp with the scent of mint, tickled the side of James's face. I don't get it, you know? Victor's words were slow, deliberate. You've got money, sure, but no one in this cabin is looking at you the way they look at me. It's about more than just paying for a seat. It's about belonging. James could feel the heat rise in his chest, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he turned his head slowly, meeting Victor's gaze head-on. I don't need to belong in your world, James said, his voice cold but unwavering. I've built my own world and I'm proud of it. And you? You'll never understand that, because no matter how much money you have, you'll always be empty inside. For a moment, there was silence. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and thick. Victor's eyes flickered, just for a split second, and for the first time since they'd started this silent battle, there was a crack in his armor. but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Victor's smile returned, but it was colder now, more calculated. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms as if he were somehow victorious. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice dripping with a new kind of venom. "You've built something. But what happens when the world realizes you're just a mechanic pretending to be something you're not? All this, it's just a facade. And sooner or later, everyone's going to see right through it." James's heart raced, but his face remained impassive. The jabs were meant to wound, to make him question himself. But James knew better than to let Victor get to him. He wasn't the mechanic he was talking about anymore. He was a businessman, a man who had earned his place at this table, not just in first class, but in life. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle between them, watching Victor, waiting for him to make the next move. The flight attendants had begun their rounds again, offering drinks and snacks. One of them, a young woman with a name tag reading Sophie, approached their row with a cart full of refreshments. She smiled brightly at James, offering him a glass of water. Her gaze lingered just a moment longer than usual, as if she, too, had noticed the undercurrent of tension between the two men. Victor barely acknowledged her, instead focusing on his tablet, tapping away as though nothing was happening. But as Sophie handed James the glass of water, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. James caught it, an unspoken gesture of solidarity. It was the smallest act, but in the moment, it felt like a lifeline. As the cart moved down the aisle, James turned back to Victor, his gaze hardening. "You can keep running your mouth," James said, his voice calm but filled with quiet power. "But I've already won. I'm sitting here because I earned it, and there's nothing you can say that will change that." Victor's expression faltered again, just for a brief moment. But like before, he recovered quickly, his smirk returning. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he studied James, sizing him up once more. "You think this is over?" Victor said, his voice low, almost threatening. "You're mistaken. This flight might seem like it's just about us, but trust me, it's not. I can make this whole thing a nightmare for you, and I'm just getting started." The words hit James like a warning shot, but he didn't flinch. The challenge was clear now. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about power, and James knew that if he was going to come out on top, he needed to stay calm. He couldn't let Victor pull him into a game he didn't want to play. But as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, James couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. Victor was pushing harder now, looking for a way to break him, to force him into submission. James looked out the window, the vast expanse of the sky stretching out before him, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe. He wasn't going to let Victor win. Not today. The cabin buzzed with the low hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glass as the flight attendants made their rounds. James, still seated in 2A, could feel the pressure mounting. The atmosphere between him and Victor had shifted into something much more dangerous, something personal. What had begun as a simple exchange of words now felt like a battle for dominance, a battle that neither man was willing to lose. Victor, ever the predator, seemed to sense the shift as well. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied James with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The earlier smugness in his demeanor had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You know," Victor said, his voice low, just loud enough for James to hear, "you've got a lot of nerve sitting here, but you don't belong in this world, James. Not really. People like you, you're not cut out for it. You don't get to sit with the elite. You're just a mechanic in a fancy jacket." The words stung, but James had been expecting them. Victor's attempts to tear him down had grown more frequent, more aggressive, but James had learned to thrive on this kind of pressure. He wasn't about to let this man or anyone define his worth. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I don't need you to tell me where I belong," James said, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "I've built my life from nothing, and I'm sitting here because I've earned it. Unlike you, Victor. You think money and status make you better, but they don't." Victor's lips twitched in irritation, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly annoyed that James hadn't taken the bait. His eyes flicked over James once again, as if searching for a crack in his resolve, something that would make him falter. But James held firm. He wasn't going to be baited into reacting the way Victor wanted. The minutes stretched on, and the tension between the two men simmered beneath the surface. The air in the cabin felt thick with unspoken hostility, and every glance exchanged between them seemed to carry the weight of a much larger conflict. Victor, who had once seemed so untouchable, now appeared to be unraveling at the edges. His confidence, though still present, was beginning to crack, and James could see it. As the plane cruised over the vast ocean, the flight attendants brought around the drinks cart once again. Sophie, the same attendant who had shown James subtle support earlier, paused as she reached their row. She smiled warmly at James, offering him a drink, her eyes flicking over to Victor briefly before focusing on him again. "What can I get you, Mr. Turner?" Sophie asked, her voice light. But there was something in her tone, something that James had heard before. It was respect. A respect that had been earned, not given freely. Victor glanced up sharply at Sophie, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment it looked like he might say something, but then he simply cleared his throat and waved her off. "I'll have a scotch," he said curtly, his voice clipped, dismissive. Sophie nodded and moved on, but James could sense the quiet defiance in her actions. It was small, but it was a message. She wasn't buying into Victor's act, and neither was the rest of the cabin. The power was slowly beginning to shift. James sipped his water, letting the moment linger. He wasn't about to let Victor's words get under his skin. But inside there was a quiet storm brewing. Victor's repeated attempts to belittle him had crossed a line, and now the fight had become something more. Something that wasn't just about pride, it was about justice. As the plane continued its steady course, Victor leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. He exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin as though trying to reclaim control over the situation. But James could feel the unease in his movements. Victor wasn't as confident as he appeared. He was rattled. "I've got to ask," Victor said, breaking the silence again. His voice was smoother now, less venomous, but still laced with arrogance. "How exactly did you manage to get yourself up here? First class isn't exactly where people like you end up." The words were a jab, a challenge, but James didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to face Victor fully, locking eyes with him. "I'm here because I earned it," James replied quietly. "I've worked my ass off to get here. You, on the other hand, were probably handed everything you have." Victor's eyes flashed with irritation, but James didn't care. The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he'd struck a nerve. This wasn't just about who belonged in first class anymore. This was about the difference between a man who had built everything from the ground up and a man who had never known what it meant to fight for his place in the world. The silence that followed was thick. For the first time, it felt like Victor wasn't sure how to respond. His gaze shifted, flicking over the passengers in the cabin, as if searching for validation. But the passengers were all too aware of what was going on, and the looks on their faces, the way they were all subtly leaning away from him, made it clear Victor was losing. He tried to recover, to regain the control he had lost, but James could see it in his eyes. The facade was cracking. The polished exterior he had so carefully maintained was beginning to unravel. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, James felt a shift. He wasn't just sitting in first class anymore. He was standing on the edge of something much bigger, a confrontation that was going to change everything. Victor had underestimated him, and now it was time to see just how far he was willing to go to prove that the world wasn't what Victor thought it was. The plane had been flying for over 3 hours now, the steady hum of the engines a constant companion. The tension between James and Victor had reached a fever pitch, and though the cabin had grown quieter, it was as if the world inside this tiny space had narrowed down to just the two of them. Every glance between them, every word spoken, felt loaded with unspoken meaning. James could feel his chest tighten with each passing minute. He knew Victor's game now. It wasn't about respect. It wasn't about whether James belonged in first class or not. Victor had already made up his mind about that. No, this was about something deeper. Victor needed to break him. He needed to show everyone, especially himself, that money and power ruled the world, and he wasn't going to stop until he had done just that. Victor, no longer content with subtle jabs, now leaned in closer, his knee brushing against James's once more. This time, there was a cold calculation in his actions, an open challenge that hung between them like an electric charge. The arrogance in his posture was unmistakable. "You know," Victor began, his voice low but forceful, "people like you, you've always been overlooked, right? In your world, you're a star. But out here, in the real world, you're nothing more than a footnote, a blip. You think this flight means something? It doesn't. It's just a ride for people like us." He smirked, glancing around at the cabin. James didn't respond immediately, but his pulse quickened. Victor's words weren't new. They were familiar. But this time, they stung differently. This time, it wasn't just about a flight. This was about who had power, who had control. "I've never been afraid of being overlooked," James said, his voice calm, but the steel behind his words was undeniable. "What matters is what I've built, what I've earned. And what you fail to see, Victor, is that you can't buy everything. You can't buy respect. You can't buy dignity." Victor's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before it returned with full force. "Respect?" he laughed. "Dignity? You talk about that like it means anything. In this world, the only thing that matters is money. And I've got more than you could ever dream of." James leaned back in his seat, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest. The cabin around them was a tense silence. The other passengers watching the exchange, their eyes flicking between James and Victor, but no one daring to speak up. "You think money makes you untouchable," James said, his gaze unwavering. "But what you don't realize is that money doesn't mean anything if you don't know who you are. It doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't make you any more deserving of this seat than anyone else. And it sure as hell doesn't give you the right to tear people down." Victor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the flight attendant, Sophie, returned with her cart, moving down the aisle. She paused when she reached their row, offering a polite smile to both men, but James could see the slight hesitation in her eyes. There was no mistaking it. Sophie had seen the subtle shift in the air between them, felt the rising tension that had turned this flight into something more than just a journey. "Can I offer you anything, Mr. Turner?" Sophie asked, her voice calm but warm, as if trying to smooth over the moment. Victor's eyes flicked between Sophie and James, irritation flashing across his face, but he masked it quickly with another smile. "A scotch, please," he said, his voice tight, barely masking his frustration. Sophie nodded and moved on to the next row, leaving behind a quiet sense of solidarity between her and James. It was subtle, but James could feel it. The crew was beginning to pick up on the dynamics, and they weren't as quick to defer to Victor anymore. But this shift in power wasn't something that Victor would easily relinquish. He sat back in his seat, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the armrest, his mind racing. His eyes darted over James once more, sizing him up as though calculating his next move. Victor wasn't going to let this go. "Well," he began, his voice dripping with forced civility, "it's clear you've got an interesting way of looking at the world. But the truth is, James, this is a game, and you're losing." His gaze flicked to the other passengers, his eyes scanning their reactions. James raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "A game?" he echoed. "You think this is some kind of game?" Victor leaned in closer, his voice dropping low. "Yes, and I'm going to make sure you lose. You don't belong here, James. I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The words hit James like a physical blow. Victor was no longer just trying to break him with words. He was trying to make a spectacle of him, to publicly humiliate him. This wasn't about respect. This was about power. But James wasn't going to let Victor win. Not like this. Not in front of the people who had been watching, who had been witnessing his every move. In that moment, James realized something that he hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't about him versus Victor. This was about proving that a man's worth wasn't defined by his appearance, his clothes, or the things he owned. His worth was defined by his character, by his actions, by the things he had built, not with privilege, but with blood, sweat, and perseverance. James wasn't going to back down. He straightened in his seat, his eyes never leaving Victor's. "You can keep trying to tear me down," James said, his voice steady and unyielding. "But the truth is, I'm here because I deserve to be. And no matter how much you want to twist that, It won't change. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing the cabin to shake slightly. The interruption didn't slow the simmering tension between them, but it did momentarily shift the focus. For a moment, the noise of the plane and the soft murmurs of the other passengers seemed to fade away, leaving just James and Victor. And in that quiet space, James knew this wasn't over. Victor might have the wealth and the power, but James had something that could never be bought. And now the fight was about to become something bigger than just the two of them. The turbulence that rattled the plane served as a brief distraction, but it did little to ease the tension building between James and Victor. If anything, it felt like the storm inside the cabin was about to burst. James had never been one to back down from a fight, especially not one as personal as this. And Victor, despite all his wealth and arrogance, was starting to realize that his attempts to break James weren't as effective as he had hoped. As the plane leveled out again, a sense of calm began to settle over the cabin, but the quiet only heightened the tension between the two men. The passengers, though they tried to look away, were all too aware of what was happening between them. The murmurs, the glances exchanged, it was all too obvious now. Something was wrong, and the discomfort was palpable. Victor leaned back in his seat, his jaw clenched, clearly frustrated that James hadn't reacted the way he had hoped. His attempts to break him down had failed, and it was starting to chip away at his usual confidence. But he wasn't ready to let the situation slip just yet. "You're making a mistake, you know that?" Victor's voice was lower now, almost pensive. "You think you've earned your place here, but you're just pretending. You're nothing more than a mechanic who got lucky. I'm not sure what makes you think you can sit here with the rest of us." James' eyes didn't leave his, the steady gaze showing no hint of fear or anger. Instead, it was the look of a man who had heard these words too many times before, a man who knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. "No one gives you the right to define who I am," James replied, his voice calm but resolute. "I've earned everything I have, and that includes my place in this seat. You don't get to take that from me, no matter what you say." Victor's grip on the armrest tightened, and for a brief moment, his mask cracked. His eyes flashed with frustration, and he almost seemed to lose control of his carefully constructed facade. But just as quickly as it appeared, he composed himself again, adjusting his suit jacket and leaning forward with a smirk. "It's not just about this seat, James. It's about everything, about where you came from, and where you'll always stay. People like you always stay in their place, no matter how hard they try to climb." James felt the sting of the words, but he didn't let them show. He had heard it all before. The whispers, the judgments, the assumptions that because of his background, he didn't belong in certain places. It was a weight he carried every day, but he wasn't about to let Victor's words add more weight to his shoulders. "I've built my life from nothing, Victor," James said, his voice low but full of conviction. "And I'm not going back. I'll never go back to the place you think I belong. You can try to tear me down all you want, but it won't work." Victor's smirk faltered again, this time more noticeably. The words that had once rolled off his tongue now seemed to stick in his throat. His pride, the thing he had built his entire life on, was beginning to crack. For the first time, James could see the doubt in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that he wasn't used to feeling. But just as quickly as that moment passed, Victor's arrogance returned. He leaned back in his seat and chuckled, a hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Good luck with that," he said, the tone dripping with false amusement. "But don't forget, one mistake, one slip-up, and you're right back where you started. People like you don't get to win. It's a game you'll never win." James sat back in his seat, the silence stretching between them. He was tired of this game, tired of playing by rules that didn't make sense. He had worked too hard to let anyone, especially someone like Victor, dictate his worth. And then, a small yet significant shift occurred. James glanced toward the back of the cabin, where Sarah Miller, the woman who had been quietly observing everything, sat. She was holding her phone in her hands, her eyes focused on the screen. But there was something different about her demeanor now. It wasn't just curiosity, it was determination. And then, as if sensing James's gaze, Sarah looked up at him, her eyes locking with his. For a moment, there was a silent exchange between them, one that no words could describe. Sarah didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to do anything. Her quiet solidarity was enough. It was the kind of small but powerful gesture that spoke volumes. James's heart skipped a beat. Amid everything, he wasn't alone. And in that moment, he realized something. He didn't have to fight this battle on his own. The truth was on his side, and sometimes that was all you needed to win. Victor, meanwhile, hadn't noticed Sarah's subtle defiance. He was too focused on his ego to notice the growing shift in the cabin. The other passengers, once passive, were now beginning to whisper among themselves. The woman in the red blazer, who had earlier been silent, was now looking at James with an expression that was no longer one of disdain. The silver-bearded man across the aisle was watching, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. And then it happened. The moment that would change everything. The flight attendants, having moved down the aisle again, paused when they reached Sarah's row. Sarah had already stood up, and she was now holding her phone up, pointing it at Victor, just as he looked over to make a snide comment to the man sitting next to him. The video had started to record. James didn't know it yet, but this video would become the catalyst for everything that was about to unfold. Sarah, with her quiet courage, had just taken the first step toward exposing the truth. And Victor's arrogance, his need to control the situation, was about to unravel in ways he never imagined. The truth was coming, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, its engines vibrating beneath the seats, as if carrying the weight of the tension that had been building for hours. The passengers around James seemed to have lost interest in the exchange between him and Victor, but that was only because they hadn't yet realized the gravity of what was about to unfold. As the minutes passed, Victor had sunk deeper into his shell of arrogance, leaning back in his seat with his arms crossed, eyes glued to his tablet. But the tension was far from over for James. He could feel the fight coming, but what he didn't know yet was that the real battle would not be fought with words anymore. It would be fought with truth. In the back of the cabin, Sarah Miller, the woman who had been so quietly observant of the drama, had already made her decision. The video she had recorded on her phone wasn't just a simple action, it was a game changer. She had seen enough. She had watched how Victor had relentlessly targeted James, heard his venomous words, and watched him tear into someone simply because of where he came from. And now, with the tap of a few buttons, the truth was about to be broadcast to the world. Sarah hit send, and the video began its journey across the internet. It would start small, a few likes, a couple of retweets, but it wouldn't stay small for long. The camera had captured everything. Victor's condescending jabs, the subtle humiliation he had inflicted on James, and most importantly, the moment he'd flung the bag of cash into James's duffel bag, a blatant attempt to set him up. What Sarah didn't know was that this video would be seen by millions, exposing Victor for what he truly was: a liar, a manipulator, and a racist who thought his money could buy his way out of anything. The first signs of change came quietly. A few rows ahead, the woman in the red blazer gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched the video play out on her phone. She leaned over to the man beside her, her voice a low whisper. "Did you see this? He planted that money in his bag. It's all on camera." The balding man in the golf shirt squinted at his screen, disbelief flashing across his face as he rewound the video. That's impossible. He's setting him up. That's a lie." The murmurs spread like wildfire, and soon the entire cabin was abuzz. James could feel the shift, but he didn't know why it was happening. His gaze flicked toward Victor, whose expression was slowly morphing from irritation to a faint flicker of concern. But it wasn't concerned with what was right. It was concerned with himself. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the cabin, as if looking for someone to help him, but there was no escape. The video was out there now. It was gaining traction, and there was no way for Victor to turn back. Sophie, one of the flight attendants, walked by their row, her eyes flicking between James and Victor as she continued with her duties. But her eyes lingered for just a moment longer on James, a quiet apology in her gaze. She had seen the video too, and it was clear that she no longer saw James as just another passenger. She saw him for who he truly was, a man who had been wronged. Victor, unable to ignore the shift in the atmosphere any longer, leaned forward in his seat, his posture tense. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling as he checked his notifications. The color drained from his face as he saw the flood of messages pouring in. Flight injustice, he muttered under his breath. Flight injustice. What is this? James, sensing that the tide was beginning to turn, finally allowed himself to relax. He knew the moment was coming. He didn't need to prove his worth anymore. The world was seeing him for who he was. The cabin was now filled with hushed whispers and wide-eyed stares. The woman in the red blazer turned to her seatmate, her voice soft with shock. That's him, the guy from the video. He planted the money. I can't believe it. Victor's eyes widened, his jaw clenching as the magnitude of the situation hit him. He stood up abruptly, his hands shaking as he tried to compose himself, but the damage was already done. The passengers were no longer afraid of him. The flight crew, sensing the change in the atmosphere, began to move with urgency. They were no longer simply performing their duties. They were now aware that they had a responsibility to address what was happening. Sophie, once again, stopped at their row, but this time, she didn't just offer a drink. She glanced at Victor, her gaze cold, and then turned to James. I'm sorry about all of this, she said softly. We'll fix it, I promise. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on James. He nodded, a quiet thank you escaping his lips. He didn't need anyone to fight his battle for him anymore. He had done that himself. But there was something about Sophie's quiet support, about the way the other passengers were beginning to rally behind him, that filled him with hope. Victor, now visibly shaken, glanced around the cabin, trying to regain some shred of control. But his eyes kept darting to his phone, to the barrage of messages, to the growing number of notifications that continued to flood in. He had been exposed, and there was no running from it. I didn't do anything, Victor snapped, his voice rising in panic. It's all lies. You can't believe them. The cabin, however, wasn't having it. The woman in the red blazer stood up, her voice firm as she spoke to the flight attendants. He planted the money in that man's bag. I saw it. It's all on video. You need to do something about this. Victor's face flushed red with anger, but no one was listening to him anymore. The people around him had turned, their support now squarely with James. The video had made sure of that. And then, just as the situation seemed like it couldn't get worse for Victor, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. We've been made aware of an issue aboard the flight, the captain said calmly. Security will be waiting for us at the gate. We're currently investigating the situation. Please remain seated. Victor froze, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrest. The cabin, once filled with the hum of the flight, was now filled with something else. A sense of justice, a sense of finality. Victor's empire, the one he had worked so hard to build on arrogance and manipulation, was crumbling in real time. And James, the man he had tried to break, was standing taller than ever. But the battle was far from over, and as the plane began its descent toward Miami, James knew that the war for justice was only just beginning. The plane descended slowly toward Miami, the city skyline gleaming in the distance. But for James, it felt as though the flight had lasted a lifetime. The last few hours had been a whirlwind. Words exchanged, accusations hurled, and a lie uncovered. Now, as the wheels touched the tarmac, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Victor Langston, the man who had once exuded power and control, sat in his seat, visibly crumbling. His phone was now silent, the notifications that had once poured in now replaced by a cold, uncomfortable stillness. He had lost the cabin, he had lost his reputation, and worst of all, he had lost the one thing he had always clung to, control. But Victor wasn't done yet. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the cabin's energy shifted again. James could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, some of them with newfound respect, others still unsure of what had truly happened. But one thing was certain, they had all seen the truth, and in a world that so often turned a blind eye to injustice, that was a rare and powerful thing. James looked over at Victor, whose face was now pale with a mixture of panic and anger. His grip on the armrest was so tight his knuckles had turned white. His usual smugness had vanished, replaced by a look of desperation. You're going to regret this, Victor muttered under his breath. though it was clear he was speaking more to himself than to James. James didn't answer. He had nothing left to prove to Victor. His fight had been won the moment Sarah Miller had posted that video. The truth had a way of working its magic, and no amount of money or manipulation could silence it. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, and the moment the seatbelt sign was turned off, the cabin came alive with movement. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, grabbed their bags, and stood up to stretch their legs. But in the midst of this chaos, one thing was clear. Victor Langston was no longer the man in charge. James stood slowly, taking a deep breath as he adjusted his jacket. He wasn't in a hurry to leave. He wasn't afraid. But he knew what awaited him on the ground. Security, law enforcement, the consequences of a man who thought his money could buy him out of anything. And Victor wasn't going to get away with this. Not if James had anything to do with it. As James made his way to the aisle, Sophie, the flight attendant who had shown him such subtle support, gave him a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that not everyone was complicit in Victor's game. There were still people who understood right from wrong. "Thank you," James said quietly as he passed her. Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes filled with empathy. "You're welcome," she replied softly. "You did the right thing." Just as James reached the door, he turned back to look at Victor one final time. The businessman had stood up, but he looked lost. His posture slumped, his eyes darting around the cabin, his expensive suit now appearing out of place in the sea of judgment that surrounded him. Victor's gaze locked with James, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes. There was fear, the fear of losing everything, the fear of being exposed for who he truly was. "You'll never get away with this," Victor spat, his voice trembling. James didn't flinch. He simply stood there, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "I didn't make this happen, Victor. You did." And with that, James turned and walked off the plane. The airport was a whirlwind of activity as James made his way toward the terminal. His heart was steady, his mind clear. He wasn't afraid of what was coming. He knew that the truth was on his side, and that was more than enough to give him the strength he needed. Security was waiting for him at the gate, but they weren't there to arrest him. They were there to escort him through the airport, away from the chaos that had followed the video's release. The viral footage had already reached news outlets, and reporters were stationed at every exit, microphones and cameras poised to capture his every move. But it wasn't about the press. It wasn't about the attention. It was about something bigger than that. It was about justice, about standing up to people like Victor Langston, who thought they could use their wealth and status to get away with anything. As he made his way past the waiting reporters, James noticed something that made his heart swell with pride. The woman in the red blazer, who had witnessed the entire exchange on the plane, was standing in the crowd, her eyes fixed on him. She gave him a small nod, a silent show of support. And behind her, the balding man who had been so quick to judge him earlier now stood with a different expression, one of quiet understanding. Victor's world had come crashing down in real time, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. Minutes later, Victor was escorted off the plane by airport security. The smugness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a look of pure panic. The officers guided him down the corridor toward the airport security office, their steps firm and unyielding. As they passed by, some of the passengers who had been on the flight glanced up, their expressions filled with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. Victor knew in that moment that his empire was crumbling. The money, the power, the influence, it was all meaningless now, and the real truth had come to light. As James exited the terminal, he could hear the reporters shouting behind him, their questions blending into a cacophony of voices. But he didn't stop. He didn't need to answer their questions. The truth had already spoken for him. His lawyer, Lena Carter, was waiting for him outside, her presence like a shield. She gave him a reassuring smile as he approached, her confidence in him unwavering. "You did it," she said, her voice calm but filled with pride. "Victor's done, and we've got the proof to take down everything he's built." James nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his chest. But there was still work to be done. The fight wasn't over yet. "Let's get to work," he said, his voice steady. And as they walked toward the awaiting car, James knew one thing for sure. Victor Langston had underestimated him, But the truth always finds a way to rise. And this time, it had shattered the facade of a man who thought he could buy his way out of anything. And James? He wasn't just surviving, he was winning. The air in the car was thick with anticipation. James sat in the back seat, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his mind racing. The events of the past few hours were unfolding faster than he could process them. As Lena Carter, his lawyer, drove, she spoke with an intensity that matched the gravity of the situation. "We've got to move fast," Lena said, her eyes glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "The video has gone viral. There's no going back now. Victor's empire is crumbling, and we need to ensure that we control the narrative." James nodded silently, his mind still processing everything. The plane, the confrontation, the viral video. Everything had led to this moment. But despite everything he had been through, there was still one thing he couldn't shake. The fear that Victor had one last trick up his sleeve. A man like him didn't lose easily. "What happens now?" James asked, his voice steady, but tinged with caution. Lena's expression softened for a moment. She could see the weight in his eyes, the uncertainty. "Now we wait. The authorities are going to do their part, and with the evidence we have, Victor won't get away with this. But you need to stay out of the spotlight for a while. Lay low. Let the law take its course." James stared out of the window, his thoughts spinning. "Victor isn't done," he said quietly. "He's not the kind of man who goes down without a fight. He's got too much pride." Lena didn't respond immediately, but after a few seconds, she exhaled, her grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "I know," she said, "but we've got everything we need. The video, the proof of his manipulation, the corrupt cop. We'll bring it all into the light. There's no way out for him now." James wasn't so sure. He had learned the hard way that people like Victor didn't always go down the easy road. They fought. They manipulated. They clawed their way back. And James wasn't convinced that this was over. Not yet. Meanwhile, back at Miami International Airport, chaos was erupting. As Victor Langston had been escorted off the plane by security, the news had already spread like wildfire. News outlets were in a frenzy, their reporters scrambling to get the latest details about the confrontation that had taken place on Flight 372. The video, now viewed by millions, had caused an uproar. The hashtags charcuterie, flight injustice, and Yachar Victor exposed were trending worldwide. But it wasn't just the internet that was buzzing. The real-world repercussions were starting to hit hard. At the airport gate, security had surrounded Victor, their faces grim as they made their way toward the back offices. But Victor's fight wasn't over. His phone had been vibrating nonstop since the video went live, but it wasn't the usual business calls. The messages that flooded his inbox were a mixture of angry clients, enraged partners, and threats of a lawsuit from his sponsors. Victor sat in the sterile office, his once pristine suit now wrinkled and disheveled. He was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear, trying to salvage what was left of his crumbling empire. But nothing he said could stop the tidal wave of backlash that was coming for him. The room was filled with a tense silence as Victor slammed his phone down on the desk. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes wild as he turned to the officers in the room. "You don't get it," he hissed. "This is just the beginning. I'll ruin him. I'll make sure everyone knows what I did for him, what I did for all of them. You think this is over?" The officers exchanged uncertain glances, their faces hardening. One of them, a senior officer who had been quiet up until this point, stepped forward. "You're in serious trouble, Mr. Langston," he said. "We have enough evidence to charge you with assault, fraud, and evidence tampering. You've already tried to shift the blame onto Mr. Turner. We're not letting that slide." Victor's anger boiled over. "This isn't just about me. It's about control," he shouted. "If I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. The people who thought they could use me. The people who thought they could push me aside. I'll expose every one of them." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The senior officer just shook his head. "The game's over, Victor. You've lost." As Lena and James made their way through the city, the last thing James expected was the phone call he received just as they reached their destination. "James, it's Lena. There's something you need to know," she said, her voice tense. "We've just learned that Victor has made a deal with a few shady figures in his past. He's trying to cover his tracks, buying his way out of the trouble he's in." James's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What are they doing? Lena paused, her voice lowering. Victor's working with a few corrupt officers to try and plant evidence against you. It's not over. He's trying to frame you for something you didn't do. James's hands clenched into fists. He's desperate, he muttered, his voice darkening. I knew it wasn't over. Lena's voice was firm. We have to act quickly. He's about to move on it. We need to expose his plan before he does anything else. This is the final step, James. We've got to make sure he's held accountable. This time, the truth will be his downfall. The weight of the situation hit James like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. This was personal. Victor wasn't going to stop at anything to destroy him, and James knew that he couldn't afford to wait. I'm ready, James said, his voice steady. Let's take him down. Back in the heart of Miami, as the media buzzed with Victor's fall from grace, the final pieces of his plan were slowly starting to unravel. James's lawyer, Lena, had already gathered enough evidence to counter Victor's manipulations. What Victor hadn't anticipated was the sheer resilience of the people he had tried to tear down. James wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced by someone like Victor. Victor Langston's empire was crumbling, but James's story was only just beginning. The city of Miami, bathed in the golden light of early morning, seemed almost unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. The skyline glittered, the hustle of the streets continued as normal, and the sounds of the city hummed on like any other day. But for James Turner, today was anything but normal. It was the final day of the battle, a battle that had begun on a plane and had now escalated into a full-scale war for justice. Victor Langston had thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. He had used his wealth, his influence, and his cunning to manipulate the truth, but now the tides had turned. Victor was about to learn that no amount of money or power could protect him from the reckoning that was coming his way. James had spent the night in his hotel room, his mind churning with everything that had happened. The video that Sarah Miller had posted had gone viral, exposing Victor for who he truly was. The authorities were closing in, and the media were relentless. But James knew the fight wasn't over yet. Victor was still dangerous, still scheming. The phone call he had received earlier from Lena confirmed his suspicions. Victor had made one last desperate move, trying to plant fake evidence to frame James. But this time, it was different. This time, they had everything they needed to take Victor down once and for all. Lena had already secured a meeting with the district attorney, and the plan was set in motion. The evidence was airtight. Victor's attempts to manipulate the situation, the planted money, the corrupt police officers, all of it would be exposed. The legal documents, the emails, the phone records, every piece of the puzzle had been carefully laid out, ready to be presented in court. But there was more. Lena had secured something even more powerful than evidence. Victor's arrogance, his pride, and his belief that he was untouchable. That was something no amount of money could fix. As the sun rose higher over the city, James stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room, adjusting his suit. It was a simple, classic look. Nothing flashy. He didn't need anything extravagant to make a statement. He had already made that statement by standing up to Victor, by refusing to be intimidated, and by revealing the truth. Lena arrived at the hotel promptly at 9 a.m., her face a picture of determination. She wasn't just his lawyer now, she was a partner in this fight. They had become a team, working together to ensure that the truth won out, no matter the cost. We're ready, she said as she met James in the lobby. Let's finish this. James nodded. He was ready, and more importantly, he was confident. Confidence wasn't something he had always had, but now, after everything he had been through, he knew that the truth was his most powerful weapon. It was a weapon Victor couldn't defend against. The courthouse was packed with media. Reporters rushed in and out, microphones thrust into the faces of anyone who had anything to say about the case. The case of Victor Langston, powerful businessman, real estate mogul, and the man who had tried to destroy an innocent man, had captured the attention of the nation. Everyone was watching. Inside the courtroom, Victor sat with his lawyer, looking more deflated than James had ever seen him. His suit, once so immaculate, now looked like a symbol of defeat, and his posture was slumped in resignation. This wasn't the confident, arrogant Victor Langston who had walked into the first-class cabin of that flight. This was a man who knew that his empire was falling apart around him. James stood tall, flanked by Lena, who was poised and professional. They had prepared for this moment, knowing that the weight of the evidence was on their side. As they walked into the courtroom, James could feel every eye on him, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, but none of them with the judgment they had once held. The trial began, and Lena presented their case with precision and passion. She laid out the timeline of events, showing how Victor had orchestrated the entire plot against James. She spoke about the corruption, the lies, and the manipulations. She even played the video of Victor planting the money in James's duffel bag, a video that had started it all. The room was silent as the truth unfolded. Victor's lawyer attempted to argue, but it was clear that the tide had already turned. They were grasping at straws, trying to spin the story into something it wasn't. But the truth was undeniable. The video, the witnesses, the evidence, it all pointed to one conclusion. And then it was Victor's turn to speak. He stood up shakily, his voice unsteady as he tried to defend himself. "You don't understand," he began, his voice filled with panic. "This isn't who I am. I did what I had to do. I was protecting my legacy. I thought I could control everything, but I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It's all a misunderstanding." But no one in the courtroom was buying it. His words, once so confident, now sounded hollow. The arrogance, the manipulation, everything about Victor had been exposed. And it wasn't just the evidence. It was the way he tried to make himself the victim, shifting the blame onto James. It was the same play he had tried on the plane, the same attempt to control the narrative. But it was too late. James rose from his seat, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about misunderstanding," he said. "This is about power, how you use it and how you abuse it. I don't need to control people, Victor. I don't need to tear others down to build myself up. I've built my life on hard work, not lies. And I'm not going to let someone like you destroy that." The courtroom was still, the weight of James's words hanging in the air. For the first time, Victor's expression faltered. The pride that had once defined him was now a mask slipping away. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. Victor Langston was sentenced to prison for his crimes: fraud, assault, evidence tampering, and corruption. James's victory wasn't just about the courtroom, it was about the message it sent. That no one, no matter how much money or power they had, could escape the truth. That justice would prevail, even against the most powerful forces. A few weeks later, James stood on the balcony of his office, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. He had made it through the hardest part of his journey, but the real work was just beginning. He had built his business, his life, and his future. And now it was time to rebuild a system that could never again allow people like Victor Langston to manipulate others. As he watched the city below, he knew that his fight wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had been pushed aside, silenced, or overlooked. It was for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. And in that moment, James realized something. Victory wasn't just about survival, it was about change. It was about making sure that when you stood up to the system, it bent, not you. With a deep breath, James turned back to his desk, ready for the next chapter. His fight was far from over, but now it had a purpose, and he wasn't going to stop until that purpose was realized. Message and lesson. This story is a powerful reminder that no matter how deep the pockets or how high the status of those who seek to control others, truth will always find a way to emerge. James Turner's journey illustrates that standing tall, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, can break through the walls built by lies and manipulation. The key lesson here is the importance of perseverance, integrity, and standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. James didn't have the luxury of wealth or influence that Victor Langston wielded, but he had something far stronger, a sense of justice that couldn't be silenced by threats, lies, or intimidation. In a world that often seems dominated by power and privilege, it's easy to feel like one person can't make a difference. But James's story proves that one voice, when backed by truth, can shatter the most carefully constructed facades. He didn't fight for personal glory. He fought for what was right, for equality, and for the dignity of every person who had been overlooked or dismissed. The lesson we take from James's journey is simple but profound. Never let anyone define your worth. Stand up for what's right, even when you're the only one standing. The truth will always rise, and in the end, it's the truth that will bring the real victory. This story also teaches us about the power of support and solidarity. Whether it was Sarah Miller's quiet act of courage by recording the video, or Lena Carter's unwavering belief in James's innocence, these moments show how standing together can change the course of events. One person's bravery can ignite a ripple effect that brings justice to those who may otherwise be silenced. Finally, this story is a call to action. It's a reminder that when we see something wrong, we must act. We must speak up, document the truth, and support those who need it most. Justice is not something that happens by accident. It is something that we must fight for every single day. Key takeaways. The power of truth. No matter how powerful or influential someone is, the truth will always prevail. Stand up for what's right. Even when it feels like the system is against you, your integrity and courage can make a difference. Support and solidarity. Change is often sparked by a single act of courage, and when we come together, we can bring about real justice. Never let anyone define you. Your worth is not determined by the opinions or actions of others. Stand tall and know that your truth has the power to change everything.